The prairie wind carried with it the scent of dry earth and wild sage, whispering through the tall grass like secrets meant for no one and everyone at once. Out here, where the sky stretched without end and the land seemed carved by the hand of God himself, every soul carried stories that weighed as heavy as the silence of night. It was in this land of struggle and survival that a widow found herself walking a road she had never chosen, yet one that fate had carved for her. She had lost nearly everything: her husband to the cruelty of time, her home to the hunger of fire, and her peace to the endless call of loneliness. Still, she endured. Her hands were steady, her gaze unflinching, but deep inside her heart carried the fragile cracks of a woman trying not to break. The frontier had no pity for the weak. Life was tested daily by dust storms, hunger, and the threat of violence that lingered like a shadow. Settlers clashed with tribes, tribes clashed with soldiers, and somewhere in between were women like her, trying only to hold families together, or, in her case, to hold on to herself. The widow had grown used to silence, used to the sound of wind and the mournful cry of coyotes at night. But what she was not used to was the sight of blood on the ground that did not belong to her, blood that painted the dry soil dark and thick under a dying sun. She had not meant to find him. She had been walking back from the creek, her small pail of water shaking in her tired hand, when she noticed the trail, a scattering of prints, half dragged, half stumbled, carved into the dirt like a story of suffering. Something in her heart warned her to keep walking, to turn her eyes away, yet her feet did not listen. Each step pulled her deeper into the tale of an unseen stranger until she saw him. He was sprawled against the earth, his body torn by wounds that told of battle. The feathers tied in his long dark hair were caked with blood, his chest rising shallow as if each breath might be his last. An Apache warrior. Her first thought was fear. Her husband, before he died, had warned her of raids, of warriors who struck fast as lightning and left nothing but ruin. Stories spread like wildfire on the prairie, and fear of the Apache was a language every settler learned quickly. But standing over him now, fear tangled with something else, something she could not name. He was not a ghostly rider of nightmares. He was flesh and blood. He was young, yet his body bore the scars of countless fights, as though he had lived lifetimes in his short years. And now he lay there, alone, the dust beneath him wet with his life. Her better sense told her to leave him. No one would question her for walking away, yet she could not. There was a pull, quiet but unyielding, that made her set down her pail and kneel beside him. His eyes were closed, his lips cracked with thirst. With trembling fingers, she offered him water. At first, he did not stir, but when the cool drops touched his mouth, his lips parted slightly, and he drank with the weakness of a child. She stayed with him until the stars began to appear, their cold silver light spilling over the plains. By nightfall, her small cabin was no longer empty. The widow, whose nights had been marked only by silence, now found herself listening to the faint, ragged breath of a stranger lying in her bed. She had cleaned his wounds as best she could, her hands shaking as she washed away dried blood. She whispered prayers, not sure if they were for him or for herself. His body was hot with fever, his face pale beneath the firelight, yet something in him seemed unwilling to let go of life. She did not know his name. She did not know why he had been left to die alone. But as she sat near him, her lantern glowing soft against the wooden walls, she felt the weight of destiny creeping close. The land outside was cruel, but within these walls, something unspoken had begun. He was her enemy, the world would say. But here, in the quiet between his breaths, he was simply a man clinging to life. That night, she did not sleep in her chair as she often did. She lay down beside him, her body weary from days of labor and years of loneliness. His warmth, though weak, reached her through the thin blanket. It was not the warmth of love or passion, but the warmth of life refusing to surrender. For the first time in years, she did not feel entirely alone. She closed her eyes, listening to the sound of his shallow breaths, wondering if he would be alive by morning. The prairie dawn rose golden, spilling across the floorboards. She stirred first, her heart pounding as she turned to look at him. He was still, his face calm, and for a moment fear pierced her fear that he had slipped away in the night. But then, faintly, his chest rose. His eyes fluttered. The widow froze, breath caught in her throat. Slowly, painfully, the Apache warrior opened his eyes. They were dark, sharp, even in weakness, and for the first time she saw the spirit within him unbroken, unyielding. His gaze found hers, and though no words passed his lips, the air between them shifted. He was no longer only a wounded man in her bed. He was alive, and his awakening carried with it a promise that her life would never again be the same. Outside, the world still bristled with division, with whispers of war and vengeance. But inside that small cabin, two paths had collided. A widow who had buried her past, and an Apache warrior who had nearly been buried by his wounds, now lay in the same fragile space. Neither had chosen it. Both were bound by it. And as his eyes lingered on hers, filled with something she could not yet name, she realized that whatever story had begun here, it would carry her into a future she could not yet imagine. The silence stretched long, heavy with unspoken questions. Who was he? What would become of him? And what place did she now hold in this tale fate had thrust upon her? Her heart raced, for deep down she knew his awakening was not just his own. It was the stirring of something larger, something that would test her courage and reshape her destiny. Yet even as she sat frozen, staring into those dark eyes, a noise in the distance cut through the stillness, the unmistakable sound of hooves pounding against the hard earth, growing closer with each passing second. The widow's breath caught again, but this time with dread. Whoever rode toward her cabin carried answers, or dangers, that would change everything. And with the warrior awake beside her, she knew the moment to choose between fear and fate had arrived. Would she stand against what was coming, or would she surrender the man fate had delivered to her door? The question hung in the air as the thunder of hooves drew nearer, and her destiny waited, heavy and unfinished. The sound of hooves beat louder, rolling across the prairie like thunder. The widow stood frozen in the middle of her small cabin, her eyes darting to the door, then back to the wounded Apache lying on her bed. His dark gaze had sharpened, no longer clouded by fever alone. He tried to push himself up, but his strength betrayed him. His arm trembled, and he collapsed back against the rough blanket, his breath ragged yet determined. She could see the fire in his eyes, even as his body failed him. Whoever was coming was not a friend to him, and she knew it. Her hands shook as she reached for the lantern, the light flickering across the wooden walls. She thought of her late husband, of how he used to stand tall at the sound of riders approaching, ready with his rifle. But the rifle now leaned unused in the corner, coated in dust. Her husband was gone, and she was alone with a man who was supposed to be her enemy. Yet as the pounding of hooves grew nearer, her instincts screamed at her to protect him. She moved quickly, pulling an old quilt from the trunk and throwing it over his body. The feathers in his hair caught her eye, the blood-stained beads that clung to his chest. She tugged the quilt higher, hiding as much of him as she could. His eyes never left hers, and though his lips did not move, his silent plea was clear. Do not let them find me. The hooves stopped just outside. Dust swirled in the air as shadows passed across her window. Her heart hammered as a firm knock rattled the wooden door. She drew in a breath, straightened her shoulders, and opened it. 3 men sat on horseback, their figures outlined against the morning sun. Settlers, armed and grim-faced, their rifles strapped to their saddles. One of them, older with a long gray beard, leaned forward in his saddle. His eyes scanned her face, then flicked past her shoulder toward the interior of the cabin. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice rough like gravel. "You've seen anything strange out this way?" Her throat tightened. She forced herself to meet his gaze. Strange. she repeated, stalling. An Apache warrior, another man cut in, his tone sharp. One got away from a skirmish, not far from here. Took a bullet, maybe two. He won't last long. But if he's limped this far, best to put him down before he stirs up more trouble. The widow felt her palms grow damp. She gripped the edge of the door, praying they could not hear the frantic beat of her heart. Behind her, she swore she heard the faint shift of breath from the bed. "I've not seen anyone," she said firmly, the lie rolling heavy off her tongue. "Been here alone since sunup. Just fetching water from the creek, tending to my chores." The gray-bearded man studied her, his eyes narrowing. He looked past her shoulder again, as if searching for shadows. "If you see him, you best tell us. These devils are cunning. A dying one is still dangerous." She nodded quickly. "Of course." They lingered another moment, the weight of suspicion thick in the air. Then, with a tug of reins, the horses turned. Dust rose as the men rode off, their voices fading into the distance. The widow stood at the doorway until they disappeared over the ridge, her body stiff with tension. When she finally closed the door, she leaned against it, her breath leaving her in a shaky rush. She turned back toward the bed. The Apache's eyes were still fixed on her, dark and unyielding. He had heard every word, and though his face gave nothing away, she felt the force of his judgment. She had lied for him, risking her own safety. And now, whether she wished it or not, she was tied to his fate. The day passed in uneasy silence. She busied herself with chores, but her mind never strayed far from the man in her bed. She thought of how her husband had died, struck down by fever the winter before. She remembered sitting in that very room, powerless to stop death from taking him. And now, here she was, fighting against death for a man she should have hated. Each time she looked at him, she noticed something new. The scars that crisscrossed his skin, each one a mark of survival. The strength in his shoulders, even as his body trembled with weakness. And the strange calm in his gaze, as though he had walked through fire before and expected to again. When the sun dipped low, she brought him broth, coaxing him to take it. He drank slowly, his hands still too weak to hold the bowl. His lips moved, forming words she could not understand. His language was not hers, but the tone told her enough. Gratitude, maybe, or defiance, or both. She wondered about his people. Did they search for him just as the settlers hunted him? Did he have a family waiting, or had war taken them all? The prairie was filled with graves of the forgotten, both white and native. She thought of her husband's grave, marked by a simple wooden cross at the edge of the field. She had wept until her tears ran dry. Perhaps this man had wept too, though his face carried no trace of it. That night she sat awake long after the stars appeared, listening again to the sound of his breathing. He was stronger than the night before, though still weak. She felt the shift in the air, the sense that time was no longer her own. His presence had changed something in her, though she could not yet name it. The next morning brought new tension. The riders had not been far. Their tracks marked the land near her cabin. They would be back, she knew. Settlers never left a trail cold. She stood at the doorway, staring at the endless sweep of prairie. It was beautiful, but beauty out here was only a thin veil over danger. She thought of the choice she had made, the lie she had told. She had saved him once, but what would happen when they came again? Inside, the warrior tried to rise. She rushed to his side, her hand against his chest, urging him to stay down. But his determination was stronger than her pleading. He sat up, sweat running down his brow. His teeth gritted against the pain. His hand brushed hers as he steadied himself, and she felt the heat of his skin, the strength that still lived in him. For a moment, their eyes met. Neither spoke. Yet something passed between them, something heavier than words. She realized then that he would not stay hidden forever. His people would want him back, or the settlers would find him, and she would be caught in the storm that followed. The prairie had always been her enemy in its loneliness. Now it had given her a new kind of test, one that reached deeper than hunger or drought. The line between enemy and ally blurred before her eyes. She had saved him, but at what cost? The sound of distant gunfire carried faintly across the plains, sharp and haunting. She stiffened, looking toward the horizon. War was always near, creeping like a shadow that never left. And in her cabin, a wounded warrior breathed life back into his body, each heartbeat pulling her closer to a destiny she had not chosen. She sat beside him again as night fell, listening to the fire crackle, her thoughts tangled with fear and questions. Outside, the prairie slept under the stars, but she knew peace was a fragile illusion. Something was coming, and the bond between her and the Apache was no accident. As the firelight flickered across his face, his eyes opened once more, steady and sharp. He whispered something she did not understand, but she felt the weight of it settle deep in her chest. Whatever he said, it carried the force of a vow. And in that quiet moment, with danger pressing close and the sound of distant riders haunting the horizon, the widow knew her life was no longer her own. The path ahead was uncertain, but it had already begun, and there would be no turning back. The widow woke before dawn, her body heavy with unrest. The fire had burned low, leaving only glowing embers in the hearth. For a moment she sat still, listening to the sounds inside her small cabin. The warrior was breathing steady, no longer ragged, but still weak. She turned her gaze to him, studying the sharp lines of his face. He had survived the night again, and with each breath he drew, the weight pressing down on her shoulders grew heavier. She had lied once to protect him, but lies were like seeds in the ground left alone. They always sprouted into something harder to hide. She rose quietly, pulling her shawl tight as she stepped outside into the pale light of morning. The prairie stretched endlessly around her, silent and unforgiving. The tracks of the riders were still visible in the dirt, circling close to her land before disappearing westward. They had not gone far. Tay would return. She felt it deep in her bones. Her thoughts drifted back to her husband. He had been a proud man, but pride had not saved him when the fever came. She remembered how he used to speak of the Apache with suspicion and warning. "They take what they want," he used to say. "A man cannot reason with them." She had believed him then. But now she wondered if the world was more complicated than those words. This man in her home was no ghost story or faceless threat. He was flesh and bone, clinging to life like any soul. When she returned inside, she found him trying to move again. His hand braced against the wall, his body trembling as he pushed himself upright. She hurried to his side, urging him to lie back, but he shook his head, refusing. His dark eyes held a quiet fire, the determination of someone who would not allow weakness to define him. He muttered words she could not understand, his voice low and strained. She wished she could speak to him, to know his story, to ask why fate had delivered him to her door. But words failed them both, divided by language. Instead, they relied on small gestures. When she pressed water to his lips, he drank. When she brought food, he ate in silence, though his eyes followed her, watchful and unyielding. Days passed, each one carrying the same tension, as though the air itself waited for something to break. The widow tended her chores, yet she felt the eyes of the land upon her. Every sound outside the call of a crow, the crack of branches made her heart leap with fear that the riders had returned. She found herself glancing toward the horizon more often, as if expecting danger to appear at any moment. At night, when the prairie winds howled, she thought about the choice she had made. If the settlers discovered the warrior in her home, they would not show mercy. She would be branded a traitor, accused of harboring an enemy. She thought of the women in town, how they whispered about her already, a widow living alone on the edge of the land. If they knew the truth, she would be cast out completely, left with nothing but shame. Yet still she could not bring herself to turn him away. Something inside her held her back, something she did not fully understand. Perhaps it was the loneliness that had wrapped around her heart like a vine, tightening each day since her husband's death. Perhaps it was the quiet strength she saw in the warrior's eyes, even as he lay broken. Or perhaps it was fate itself, weaving a story she could not yet see the ending to. The conflict outside her walls mirrored the conflict inside. The settlers wanted vengeance, the tribes wanted survival, and she was caught between them with no clear path forward. Each night she lay awake beside the faint glow of the fire, wondering what her role truly was. Was she betraying her own people by saving him? Or was she honoring something deeper, something more human than the lines men had drawn in the dust? The warrior grew stronger with each passing day. His wounds began to knit together, though the scars would remain. He could sit upright now, and sometimes she caught him looking out the window, his gaze fixed on the horizon. There was longing in his eyes, and sorrow, too, though he never spoke of it. She wondered if his people thought him dead. She wondered if they would come for him. The thought filled her with both fear and hope. One evening, as the sun bled across the sky in shades of red and gold, she noticed smoke rising in the distance. Not from her chimney, not from any cabin nearby, but from the open plains. Her breath caught. Smoke could mean many things: campfires, signaling, or worse, destruction. She stepped outside, shading her eyes against the fading light, and felt the chill of unease settle deep in her chest. When she returned inside, the warrior's eyes met hers. He had seen it too. His jaw tightened, his body tense despite his weakness. He muttered something, a single word repeated like a prayer or warning. She wished she understood. She wished she could bridge the gap between them, but all she could do was sit beside him, her hand resting briefly on his arm, offering the only comfort she knew. That night, she dreamed of fire. She dreamed of riders thundering across the land, of faces twisted in anger, of voices shouting words she could not make out. She woke with a start, her chest heaving, the sound of hooves still echoing in her ears. The warrior was awake too, his dark eyes watching her in the flicker of firelight. For a moment, they simply stared at one another, the silence heavy with unspoken fears. The next day, she walked to the creek for water. The air felt different, sharper, carrying the weight of things unseen. She knelt by the water's edge, filling her pail when she noticed movement across the ridge. Riders again, a tease, but these were not settlers. Their silhouettes moved differently, their presence quieter, more measured. She froze, her breath trapped in her throat. She returned quickly to the cabin, her steps fast and uneven. When she burst inside, the warrior was already sitting upright, his body trembling but alert. His eyes questioned her, demanding answers she could not give in words. She set down the pail, her hands shaking, and whispered, though he could not understand, "They're coming." The cabin felt smaller than ever, its walls pressing close around them. The widow knew she could not keep secrets forever. Whether it was settlers seeking blood or the warrior's own people searching for him, the storm was drawing near. She had taken him in, saved his life, but in doing so, she had bound herself to a fate that was no longer her own. Every choice she made now carried a cost. If the settlers returned and found him, she would pay with her freedom or her life. If his people came and found her, a lone settler woman hiding one of their own, what would they do? The questions circled endlessly, each one heavier than the last. Yet when she looked at him, when she saw the strength returning slowly to his body, she felt something else stirring inside her. Not just fear, but a quiet resolve. Perhaps she could not control the forces raging across the land, but she could control this act of defiance, this act of humanity. Still, the prairie was not merciful. Each sunrise carried new danger, and each sunset brought whispers of choices yet to be made. The widow could feel the world closing in, the walls of her simple life crumbling under the weight of something larger than herself. She was a woman alone, but no longer empty. She had taken in a man the world called her enemy, and now the lines between right and wrong blurred like smoke across the sky. The sound of distant drums carried faintly through the night air. She could not tell from where, nor what they meant, but the warrior heard them too. His eyes grew darker, his body tense, and in that moment she knew the conflict had only just begun. The storm was coming, and she stood at its very center, unprepared yet unwilling to turn back. The widow had never imagined her quiet, lonely nights would be broken by the presence of a man who carried the fire of survival in his eyes. When she first saw the Apache warrior lying at her doorstep, pale and torn by battle wounds, she thought he would not make it through the night. His breath was shallow, his skin cold, and his spirit seemed ready to slip away. Yet something inside her refused to let him die. She dressed his wounds with trembling hands, whispering words of prayer as if the strength of her faith alone could hold him back from the shadows. Days passed, and though the warrior lingered between life and death, he did not leave her. He remained on the thin line where hope and despair met, and every sunrise she expected to find him gone. But then, against all odds, his eyes opened. The depth of them startled her, dark pools filled with both pain and fire. It was not gratitude that showed first, nor trust, but something primal defiance, as if death itself had been denied. She had been alone for so long, and now there was someone breathing in her home. The sound of his voice, low and rough from thirst, filled the cabin one morning. He asked where he was and why she had saved him. She could not answer truthfully, for she did not know herself. Perhaps it was pity, perhaps it was a need for purpose. Perhaps, deep down, it was destiny pulling her into something larger than the quiet life she had tried to keep. The warrior did not speak much, but his presence grew heavier each day. The scars on his body told a story of battles she could not imagine. Sometimes at night he stirred violently, his face twisting with nightmares, his hand reaching for a weapon that was no longer there. She sat awake during those hours, the flickering lamplight making shadows dance across the room, wondering if she had brought danger into her own home, and she had reason to fear. Whispers reached her ears from the small town miles away. Men spoke of raids, of Apache warriors striking back against soldiers and settlers alike. Tension hung thick in the air, and every stranger on horseback seemed like a warning. She knew if they discovered who lay in her cabin, their fury would fall on her too. Yet the thought of sending him away gnawed at her. He was not a monster, as the townsfolk said. He was flesh and blood, carrying his wounds like chains, and in the quiet moments when his guard slipped, she saw the humanity inside him. The nights grew colder, and storms swept across the plains. Inside, the widow found herself caught in a storm of her own. The warrior's silence was not empty. It carried weight, pulling her thoughts toward questions she had never dared ask. Why had he fought? What had he lost? What kind of life had shaped the man lying on the bed she once shared with her late husband? There were times she caught his gaze lingering on her, not with softness, but with a searching intensity, as if he was trying to understand her just as much as she tried to understand him. The tension was unspoken, woven between each word they did not say. Every meal shared in silence, every brush of their hands when she changed his bandages, fed a growing fire beneath the surface. But danger pressed closer with each passing day. Riders had been seen not far from her land. The townsmen were restless, talking of hunting down survivors from the last Apache skirmish. She knew if they found him here, they would not listen to her pleas. They would burn her home to the ground, and worse, they would make her a warning for all who dared defy their fear. She thought of sending him away, but the warrior was not yet strong enough to walk more than a few steps without pain. And yet, she began to sense that even in his weakness, he carried a spirit that would not break. He was not a man who would bow or beg. He was a man who would rather die standing than live on his knees. That spirit frightened her, but it also filled her with a strange kind of courage. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of red across the horizon, he spoke more than he ever had before. He told her of betrayal, of soldiers who had broken promises, of his people driven from their lands. His voice did not tremble, but she heard the grief beneath the words. It cut deeper than any wound on his body. She realized then that saving him had tied her fate to his. His enemies would become hers. His burdens would weigh upon her shoulders too. The widow's heart raced with questions she could not ask aloud. Was she ready for the storm that was coming? Was this man the end of her quiet survival, or the beginning of something far greater? Nights grew restless. The sound of horses sometimes carried across the wind, and every creak of the floorboards in her cabin seemed louder than before. She began to keep a rifle close by, though she had never fired it at another soul. The warrior watched her, his dark eyes holding both warning and something else she could not name. It was as though he knew the moment was coming when everything would break. And then came the night that changed everything. The air was heavy, the kind of silence that presses down before a storm. The widow could not sleep. She sat by the fire, listening to its crackle, when she heard the distant sound of hoofs. Her blood ran cold. They were coming. The warrior, though weak, sat up in his bed as if he had felt it too. Their eyes met, and in that instant she understood they stood at the edge of something far larger than themselves. Fear gripped her, but beneath it was something stronger, a resolve she had not known she possessed. She had saved him once when he was dying, but now she knew saving him again might cost her everything. The hooves grew louder, closer, until they seemed to shake the earth itself. The cabin felt smaller, trapped between the pull of fate and the weight of fear. The widow's hands trembled as she gripped the rifle. The warrior's eyes never left her, steady, unyielding, carrying the promise of both danger and destiny. In that breathless moment, with the world outside pressing in and the firelight flickering across their faces, the story of both their lives was about to change. The widow stood between survival and sacrifice, torn between fear and the pull of something deeper. And just as the shadows of riders began to emerge on the horizon, the warrior whispered something that made her heart stop. Words that would carry them both into the storm that was waiting. The sound of horses outside the cabin grew louder, shaking the earth and rattling the wooden walls. The widow held her breath, her rifle clutched tight in her trembling hands. The Apache warrior sat up, despite his wounds, his gaze steady and unafraid. It was as though he had been waiting for this moment, as though he had always known danger would find him here. Their eyes met, and she felt his strength pour into her, not through words, but through the silent weight of trust. He had no weapons, no way to defend himself fully, and yet his presence filled the room like a shield. The riders came into view through the window. She recognized some of the men from town, their faces twisted with suspicion and fear. They dismounted, their boots crunching against the frozen earth as they approached her door. Each step felt like a drumbeat, echoing in her chest. She knew what they wanted. They had heard whispers, seen tracks, and suspected she was hiding someone. And now they were here to drag the truth from her home. Her heart pounded as fists slammed against the door. She froze for a moment, caught between the pull of fear and the weight of choice. The warrior's voice broke the silence, low but firm. He told her she had already done enough, that she owed him nothing more. He would not let her burn for him. His words were steady, but she could see the pain in his eyes, a man ready to meet his end if it meant sparing her. But the widow's soul stirred with something she had not felt in years. After losing her husband, she had lived in the shadows, surviving quietly, never daring to stand against the world. Yet here was a man who had fought for his people, endured loss, carried scars, and still refused to bow. Something in his strength awakened her own. She realized she could not betray him. Not now, not after everything. She opened the door, her rifle steady in her hands, though her knees nearly buckled. The men outside sneered, their eyes searching the small cabin. One of them demanded to know if she was hiding an Apache inside. She forced her voice to stay calm, her words simple but strong. She told them no man was here but her, that the land was hard enough to survive without them bringing war to her doorstep. The lie burned her tongue, but her will did not waver. For a tense moment, the men stared at her, their suspicion thick in the air. Then one pushed past her, stepping into the cabin. The widow's heart raced, but the warrior had already slipped into the shadows. His weakened body pressed against the farthest wall, hidden from sight. The intruder searched quickly, kicking at the bedframe, peering into corners, but the firelight and the widow's calm words seemed to weaken his conviction. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the men left. They muttered threats, warning her not to betray their trust, and mounted their horses once more. The sound of hooves faded into the distance, leaving behind silence so heavy she nearly collapsed. Her hands shook as she closed the door, her chest heaving with relief and fear. The warrior spoke her name softly, a rare thing, his voice carrying gratitude deeper than any words could truly express. She looked at him and saw more than a wounded fighter. She saw a man whose life she had chosen to protect, and in that choice she discovered a strength she never knew she had. The days that followed were marked by both tension and quiet healing. The warrior regained his strength slowly, walking with more certainty, his shoulders straightening once more. He began helping her with small tasks, chopping wood when he could, repairing what little her home needed. In his silence, she found a comfort she had not known since her husband's passing. But it was not without hardship. Rumors in town grew sharper. Strangers lingered near her land, and she knew the danger had not passed. Yet with every sunrise, she felt less like a woman hiding and more like a woman standing firmly in her own truth. The warrior had given her that, not through demands or promises, but by simply existing as he was. One evening, when the horizon burned gold and the air was heavy with the scent of pine, the warrior told her his time to leave was near. His people needed him. His path lay beyond her land. The widow's heart clenched at the thought of him going, yet she knew she could not hold him back. Destiny was not something to chain. She only asked if she would see him again. His answer was not a promise, but a truth. He said their paths had crossed for a reason, and that reason would never be undone, no matter how far the distance. When he finally left, carrying his strength back into the world, the widow stood at the doorway, watching until he was only a shadow against the vast plains. The silence of her cabin returned, but it was not the same silence as before. It was not empty. It was full, layered with the memory of what had been shared and the courage it had awakened within her. The town never knew for certain what had happened in those weeks. Whispers remained, but no proof ever surfaced. The widow returned to her quiet life, but inside she was changed. She no longer carried only grief. She carried the strength of a man who had fought for his people, the fire of a bond that had defied fear, and the knowledge that even the most ordinary life could be touched by destiny. The seasons shifted, and the land endured its storms and calm days alike. She grew older, but she never forgot the warrior who had once lain near death in her home, whose presence had rewritten the course of her days. At night, when the wind carried the cry of wolves or the far-off sound of drums, she sometimes closed her eyes and felt as if he were still near. A reminder that courage does not fade, and love does not always need to be spoken aloud to be real. Her story became one of survival, but not just her own. It became a story of trust, of crossing boundaries built by fear, of standing when it would have been easier to hide. She learned that life did not end when loss came, that new paths could open even in the most unexpected moments. And when she finally grew old, the widow found peace in knowing she had lived not in silence, but in courage. She had chosen to stand beside a man others would have condemned, and in doing so, she had found her own strength. Her destiny had indeed changed the moment he opened his eyes in her cabin. And though the years carried them down different roads, the bond they shared remained written in the quiet spaces of her heart. In the end, the story of the widow and the dying Apache warrior was not one of fear or defeat. It was one of hope, courage, and the unspoken understanding that sometimes the most unexpected encounters carry the power to change everything. It was a reminder that even in the loneliest corners of the world, destiny can find its way to your door, and when it does, the choice you make can define the rest of your life.